In this video, I want to explain how backend development really works for new developers in a very simple way. What things we actually do in our backend development, the roles of the backend server and the database server, and how data reaches the front end through APIs. Before we get into the backend development, let's really understand what the front end actually is. The front end is everything users directly see on the screen or in the browser, the buttons, forms, and the entire interface. It uses HTML and CSS languages to create and style the page, while JavaScript adds all the functionality and interactivity that makes the page come alive. Alright, that's the front end. Now let's dive into the back end and explore how it powers everything. In backend development, you might think there is just a one server or a machine, but in reality, two different servers are working together behind every web application. First is the backend server, and the second one is the database server. These servers have very different roles, and these servers can be hosted separately on any online infrastructure, such as cloud services, or you need to create your own physical infrastructure to host them. The backend server. This is where your backend languages like Node.js or PHP runs. It handles logics, user requests, and connects everything. We will explore how it works in more detail later. The database server, on the other hand, stores and manages your data using languages like SQL, MongoDB. Both are part of the backend, but they have completely different roles and even different languages running on them to handle them. In this video, we will break down how these two servers work together, what each one does, and how your frontend actually gets data from them through APIs. A lot of new developers think that when they request data from the database, their data comes directly from the database server to the front end or your application. But that's not true. The database does not talk to your front end directly. Now you might be thinking, if the data is stored in the database, why cannot the front end just get the data directly from it? The short answer is it is not safe and it does not work that way. To communicate with a database, we need special credentials like username, password, and connection details with associated database. If we try to connect the database directly from the front end, those credentials will be visible in the browser code. That means anyone could see them, which is a huge security risk, and anyone could interact with the database server. This means they could read, change, or even delete your data all without permission. But in real application, we only give the users exact predefined permissions for what someone is allowed to delete or change. So how do front-end interact with the backend server? Instead of direct connection between the front-end and database, every request from the users first goes to the separate backend server through API request. Think of backend server as a middleman. The backend server receives the request from the front end, validates it, processes it, and then decide what to do with the database. The backend server acts as a protected layer between the users and the database. It hides the database credentials, checks if the user is allowed to do something, and validates all the incoming data and requests before it ever reaches the database. So instead of giving users full access to the database server, we let them talk to the backend server, and the backend server first check if the users have data access permission and talk to the database safely on its behalf. But the backend server does not just act as a security layer between your front end and the database. It does much more. This is where the actual logic of your web application runs. To build these functionalities and logics of the backend server and define what permissions roles different users have and define some other rules, we use special programming languages like Node.js, PHP, or Python on the backend server, along with their framework that are specially designed to handle the backend server. Backend server plays several important roles in how your application works, like authentication, which checks who you are. When you log in with your email and password in an application, the backend server confirms your account is valid by checking these details are correct by matching these from the database records. If details matches, the user get access through a token. Every time you send a request to interact with a database, backend server checks if the request is coming from a valid user by validating this token. Then authorization. It decides what each user can do, like an admin can delete posts, but a normal user can't do it. Like this, we use backend server to define many different roles for different users. Then data validation. Before saving anything in the database, the backend server checks if the data is in the correct format, like if the email format is valid or the password is strong. While basic validation can happen on the front end, that layer is not fully secure. Someone could bypass it. So the backend performs its own validation as a second layer of protection. Business logic is where all the rules of your app live. For example, when you buy something, the backend can do calculations like calculates the total price and applies discount. The backend also perform all kind of operations, building logics and applies rules using algorithms. Integrations: the backend server connects your app with external services like Stripe for handling payments, which needs to be done securely at the backend server, or even connects to the other servers to get data for your application. Another important job of the backend server is handling real-time communication. This is used in things like chat apps, online games. When two users are messaging each other, the backend creates a live connection, so messages can be sent and received instantly through backend server and save this data in database server if required. The same happens in gaming. When players move, shoot, score points, or interact, the backend quickly sends those updates to everyone in real time. So anytime you see instant updates, typing indicators, online status, chat messages, or fast game actions, that's the backend server making real-time communication possible. And there are many other important roles that the backend server perform as well, all working together to make your web application run smoothly. Now let's talk about how the front end and backend server communicates with each other. They talk to each other using something called APIs, Application Programming Interface. You can think of APIs as a way for two computers or programs to talk and share information. Here how it works. The front end sends a request to the backend server to run a specific piece of code. That code can do anything, like getting data from the database, processing a login request, or performing some calculations, and then sends the response back to the front end. So whenever we want the backend to do a specific task for us, we send a request and we call this an API request, and the backend replies us with a response in return. Now let me show you what a real API code snippet looks like on the backend server. This example is written in Node.js server-side language with Express.js framework. Node.js uses the same syntax as JavaScript. It can also be written in other languages like Python, PHP, each with their own framework. The following code you see is an API and a backend server code to get a list of users in our application. When we call this API, we will see how to call an API from the front end later. In this API, we declare the sample users data here, but in reality, first we fetch this type of data from the database server inside our API and responds to the front end with that data received from the database to our front end. The part API/users is an endpoint. It tells the backend server which specific API or piece of code we want to call. We can name these endpoints anything we like it on our own. We can create multiple APIs on the same server, each with a different endpoint, like API/products, API/login, or API/orders to handle different type of data and operations. These all operation executes at the backend by just calling this API from the front end. Now let's see how to call an API with a specific endpoint from our front end code. This is a piece of JavaScript code runs in the browser on our front end. It calls the API with API/users endpoint on the backend server when the user make a request. This response can give us a list of users returned from the backend API, which we can then display in our application. Or if something goes wrong, the API will send back an error message instead. https://myserver.com is the address of our backend server where our backend server and its code is hosted. The part API/users is an endpoint. It tells the server which specific API we want to call. Now let's talk about the database server. This is where all your website's actual data lives. Things like user accounts, product details, messages, they are all stored here. It's a separate system that specializes in storing, retrieving, and managing structured data efficiently. To interact with the database, we do not use normal programming languages. Instead, we use special query languages like SQL that are made to store, fetch, and manage data. The question is, how and where did we write our SQL or any database language code? We do not write our database language code on the database server. So where did we write our database language code? We actually write our database language code on the backend server alongside with server-side languages like PHP or Node.js. We use database languages to communicate with the database server from our backend server. The backend server connects us to the database server to update or fetch the data from the database server. When the backend server receives an API request from the front end, it sends that SQL query inside the API to the database server. The database server executes the query and returns the data based on that query to our backend server. We can use this data in our backend server or send this data as a response back to our application. Now let's see an example code of how it actually works. This is an API code at the backend server. When we call this API from the front end, it sends this define SQL query select name role from users to the database server, and in response database server returns all the name and roles of the users in the database records in users variable at our backend server. We can use this users data in our backend server or send this data as a response back to our application. This is another piece of code used to create a new user record in the database. To create a new user record in the database, we need to call a different API with a different query to write data in the database. This API accepts name role data of the new user in its request when called from the application. When the user calls this API from the front end, the API also receives the new user data in its request, execute the SQL query with that data on the database server to store it, and then send back a response indicating whether the data was saved successfully or not. So now you have seen how different servers work together behind the scenes. So let's rewind now. When a user performs an action on the front end, like clicking a button or submitting a form, the front end sends an API request to the backend server. The backend server receives this request, processes it, and sends the SQL query to communicate with the database server, either to get existing data or to store a new data. After getting the results from the database server, the backend sends the response back to the front end, and the user sees the result instantly in the browser. That's how the whole backend system works, connecting the front-end, backend server, and database to make our web application dynamic and interactive. Alright, that's all for this video. If you still have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I answer every one of them. If this video helped you understand backend development better, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more web development content. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.